Hi, I'm Dr. Martin Rutherford, and I am a well, I guess I'm a certified, I could say board certified. I'm a certified functional medicine practitioner, certified by the Chiropractic Board in Nevada to be able to say that. I also am a chiropractor for 36 years. This is
Dr. Randall Gates. I'm a board certified chiropractic neurologist, as well as being a chiropractor.
Okay. So, and we say that for those of you who haven't seen us yet, or it's the first time you've ever looked at us. We have a developed by mushing mushing these two disciplines together, one which emphasizes the brain and the nervous system, and the other which emphasizes pretty much everything else, to develop a chronic pain practice, which is continuing to develop. We keep seeing more and more interesting patients as people readings to us. And there are just certain things that we have seen over the years that are absolutely necessary to address these chronic pain issues. We have a very organized paradigm that we have put together, and at this point, we just simply kind of keep tweaking it and tweaking it and tweaking it. Diet now is something we don't have to particularly argue with people about in general relative to getting them better. However, I do all the intakes, and now that we have so much information out there on so many diets, I get so many people in here who are now experts on their diet and the diet that they should be using, or the diet that they use that didn't work. So we're going to talk today about sugar. We're going to talk about the truth about sugar, the glycemic index, which is one of the dietary tools that people come in and need to understand better when they're trying to promote to me how we need to do that for them, and determining if your diet is insulinogenic. I had a radio show back in the 90s, late 90s, and this topic is what got me into that show.
Oh, really?
It's what I was so confused.
I did not know that.
He didn't know that. I was so confused on all of the diets. And we also had the advent back there of do you eat fat, do you not eat fat, do you eat sugar, do you not eat sugar, we had the Atkins diet, do you eat meat, do you become a vegetarian? Those were the basics. But we had the South Beach diet, we had the Zone, who Barry Sears, who I got to interview. We had just decrease your calories and increase your exercise diet. We had and we have today, we had FODMAP diets. Back then we had a blood type diet. We have Atkins diet. We have the specific carbohydrate diet. People come into me to talk about the glycemic index. So for a long time, these diets were considered fads, and that they were really, really kind of put down by the medical profession, other than just lose weight by eating less and exercising more. Today, that's not the case. We went to a seminar a year and a half ago, maybe a year ago, September, and it probably ended up being about 40 or 50 hours. I forget what it was supposed to be. And
36. It was about 50 hours. It was supposed to be 36.
Yeah, and basically 95% of it was about diet. Maybe all of it was about diet. I was thinking of the neurological guy. So it's out there. Just yesterday, there was a huge article. I want to say a huge article. There was articles on the success of the Mediterranean diet relative to brain function, and they were talking about how, and I can't remember that. I read through it rather quickly, and they were talking about how the Mediterranean diet shows positive results for brain function. And if you lean more heavily towards the oils, it was good for your frontal lobe. And if you lean more heavily towards the nuts, I don't remember what part of the brain it was good for. But the point being that it's well accepted now. So now we need to understand that there's no one diet for everybody. And we need to, and as I was talking with Dr. Gates before we did this, I do the intakes, I'm involved with the exams, I'm involved with deciding what patients we take or not. Dr. Gates does all the treatment. He does all of our research. And he uses several different types of diets with patients, depending on findings of the history and the exams and the blood test. And he'll use everything from a FODMAP diet to an SCD diet to a variation of the paleo diet, to a dietary recommendations that he makes up as he goes along relative to the patient's insulin problems. And so there's no one diet for chronic pain, just for those of you who are maybe having chronic pain and happen to be watching this, okay? And a lot of our viewers that watch us every week have chronic pain or interested in treating chronic pain. So there's no one diet because everybody is different. You could almost argue again that it starts in the gut, and that depending on what's going on there really is what's going to dictate which diet works for you that didn't work for your next door neighbor. And it's really, really, really very specific to each person. Today, Dr. Gates picks the topics. Thank goodness, takes a lot of pressure off of me now because he does a 100 times better job than I'd ever do at it or used to do at it. And these are a lot more interesting topics because they're more pertinent, because he's out there treating people and he understands more what needs to be done relative to getting people from chronic pain to very little chronic pain or no chronic pain and being able to control it. Insulinogenic, an insulinogenic diet is something that really needs to be considered today because as we have in our notes here, we have a problem with blood sugar in our country. And frankly, it's much, 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 much wider than is understood. And I'll let you kind of go on with that. And if I'm talking from the perspective that we're mostly paying attention to diabetes, we're paying a little bit of attention to insulin resistance, which is probably as big a problem or more than diabetes. And low blood sugar is an issue. It's just a huge issue in this country. And we're going to talk about why and why you need to understand how different an insulinogenic diet is relative to this glycemic index thing, which kind of is a shaky, concept. And we'll talk about that. So we have a problem with sugar in this country. You want to tell them what it is?
I do, yes. And thank you also for all of you out there who watch, who give us suggestions. This talk came from a suggestion that we melded with things that were frustrating me in working with some of our patients, not from a negative perspective, but the fact that just a lot of our patients don't fully understand the ramifications of the insulinogenic foods that they're consuming on a daily basis. We've been conditioned that a lot of these foods are normal. It's normal to have things like sweet teas, and how could that pose a problem when I'm good on my diet 80% of the time and I eat vegetables? And we'll go into all of that.
Yeah, and frankly, I mean, it's how would they understand? Why would they
There's
understand?
so much mass confusion out there, kind of like you and I were talking about.
We just talked about, and we didn't even talk about half of the diets just now, you know.
And the Mediterranean diet has a lot of good qualities, but you can definitely OD on some of the products on the Mediterranean diet,
Absolutely.
thinking that you're being healthy.
Or some of our patients don't do very good with red wine.
Another example.
I mean, not even a little teeny bit of red wine, like the patient that we had yesterday, who from the lady from Russia.
Yeah, some of our patients have allergies to tomatoes, or food intolerances is the more appropriate term. Food intolerances to shellfish. All these things have to be worked out. And we started.
For the patient.
You started 6-7 years ago. I started with you 5 to 6 years ago now. And at that time, we were using gluten-free diets. Then it transitioned to gluten-free, dairy-free, soy-free diets. Then it transitioned.
And egg-free.
Oh yeah, and egg-free. Yeah, I mean, it's just burgeoned from there into, just several diets, as Dr. Rutherford was alluding to. And it's almost as though now we excuse the fire engine out there, but now it's almost I tell each patient that this is a baseline diet we're going to work from, and we're probably going to deviate from there. Yeah,
it's our baseline. It's the Power Health diet. Health diet. What our Power Health diet is, we basically have taken out every allergen we've ever seen anybody ever have and come and walk into this office. And then that's how you start. And it's a pretty thin diet. But it's not a diet that people are on for the whole treatment, and it's not a diet that people are on forever. It has to be reconstructed for that patient's particular physiology, as well as that patient's particular physiology, plus their pathology, plus what we find on those tests and in the history. So,
going into the overview, we discussed the movie Fed Up at one point last year. In essence, it's widely talked about in the alternative literature as well as the public health literature that we have a growing epidemic of body mass in this country. A lot of it relates to sugar. We have 1/3 of us right now are overweight. Another third of the population is obese. The forecasts are that by 2050, 2/3 of the American population will be obese and 1/3 of us will be diabetic. And we don't have a healthcare system that can really sustain those numbers.
So will we probably ever have one in our lifetime.
So we have a tidal wave of a problem that's brewing, deep in the Pacific. And we need to take a hold of it now. And the best way to take a hold of it is for you to watch this video and for you to pass it on to others around you. We're not soliciting, but what I have seen people say, well, what's the solution to the problem? I really think the solution to this problem is a grassroots effort. You're not going to see this talked about in the mainstream media. Really, you may hear a little bit about it, but it's not going to be pounded into you like the Chick-fil-A commercials. Nothing against Chick-fil-A. It looks really good. But those commercials that we all see on TV all the time, wanting us to have this product or that product that may have high insulinogenic potential. Again, nothing against Chick-fil-A. That was just...
Yeah, you could have picked the less controversial. Let's go to McDonald's and jump on the band.
There we go. They're having a hard time right now from a corporate perspective. They're losing money. Their CEOs
they're losing money. People are eating less of their food. They're putting in healthier foods, and their market is not people who won't go there to eat healthy foods.
But the CEO is supposed to have the solution, I think, in about 2 weeks now.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll find out.
So overall, it's a humongous problem. And so it'd be helpful for you. So we're going to talk about sugar, because everything breaks down the sugar, whether you realize it or not. But you need to know how this works. Most people that come in have a vague idea that sugar and their insulin are related. They have no idea about pancreas versus liver versus maybe even adrenals. I don't know how far you want to go into.
I know what you mean. You're right. And a lot of them.
Let's talk about and how stress could affect and blah blah blah. So why don't we do that?
Okay. And a lot of you have been conditioned, especially back in the 1990s, that low fat is really good for you to lose weight. So the low fat diets. I know when my parents were trying to lose weight back in the 90s, that was all the rage.
That was another one.
A lot of you have this concept that, man, if I eat fat, I'm going to get fat, and got to eat good sources of carbohydrates and whole wheat. And we're not saying that's not necessarily the case for everybody, but we'll go into the rationale behind that. But back to the issue at hand. So how sugar is processed.
Could it have anything to do with that our brain is like what percentage of fat?
And
that they had people eating not enough fat to even support brain function for the day. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's a lot to this diet stuff. You have to be really careful. I mean, you just have to be careful. Don't try a diet because your neighbor said it's good. How is the sugar processed in the body?
The sugar is processed in the body. Let's say we drink a cola. So I won't use any specific brand name. So you drink a cola, a pop, as it used to be termed. And so that cola goes into your stomach, and then it's going to go from your stomach into your small intestines.
And any cola that has 17 or 18 teaspoonfuls of sugar in it works, because that's what they have, for those of you who have been living on Mars and aren't aware of that.
Or the equivalent of high fructose corn syrup, which is even worse, but we won't even, that's a whole nother talk. And so that sugar, these multiple teaspoons of sugar in your small intestines are then going to get absorbed into your bloodstream. And your bloodstream immediately goes right to your pancreas. In essence, your pancreas is sitting there watching, seeing how much sugar is coming by it. And once it sees a lot of sugar, it's going to make insulin, and it's going to pour that insulin into circulation. And that insulin and the sugar actually goes to your liver, and then from there it goes throughout the rest of your body. And that insulin has the primary purpose of getting the sugar from your blood into the cells of your body. As Dr. Rutherford used to do this example for all of you watching.
And the importance is every cell in your body, particularly brain cells, need proper glucose to function. Not too much, not too little.
Right.
Just the right amount.
An interesting aspect of that is that insulin doesn't really have a major function in the brain. So as you're saying, sugar has to be really regulated throughout the rest of the body for it to have a normal function, the sugar in the brain, because the brain just basically takes up whatever's there. That's how sugar is processed in the body from a simple perspective.
So the sugar hits the cell opens up, the glucose goes in, your cell uses it to make energy, life is good.
Yeah. And that's how
until you drink 6 of those colas a day.
Yeah. I used to think
for a year or more.
Yeah. 15 years.
Along with
the
your
way
Dunkin'
we grow up.
donut. Oh, I shouldn't have said Dunkin'. Along with your donuts in the morning. Everything now.
Everything is processed. A lot of our foods are just so carbohydrate dense. Fast food is, a commonality in our society.
So we flood our system with sugar. Are we there yet? The diabetic continuum issue that we have, are we talking with people going from low blood sugar to insulin resistance to diabetes? Why don't you discuss that? This is a very important concept, folks. This is one of the 7 or 8 keys that we work with every day and has to be corrected, especially if you got chronic pain, to take you from here to there, particularly if you have diabetes and peripheral neuropathy. But this crosses every spectrum of chronic pain. So.
And I don't know if I've read this term diabetic continuum somewhere and it was in my subconscious, or if I created it.
I've never seen it. So I'm going to say that there's a good possibility you created it. But he's read about 1 million pages of stuff, so it might be buried somewhere in something.
And that's where we got the term insulinogenic, because insulinogenic is actually a relatively new term as well, but it is in the literature. So the diabetic continuum. So continuum is basically a spectrum, if we want to think of it that way. And if you think of yourself early in life, what do we do if we give sugar to kids? We say, oh, they're going to be bouncing off the walls, because at that point, when they consume sugar, they get a lot of energy from that sugar because they have normal insulin function. So when they consume a lot of sugar, insulin is working well. So they get all that sugar into the cells of the body, and their cells have tons of cellular energy. As we progress, we beat our bodies up. And it can take, some of you don't beat your bodies up. Some of you eat have eaten or ate a very healthy diet most of your lives. Others have not. And I think really it's the majority of our population.
Yeah, you just gave the statistics.
A very healthy diet.
People developing blood sugar problems.
And in that course of events, as we eat these high carbohydrate dense foods, we're going to have a tendency to make more and more and more insulin. And insulin is very anabolic. So insulin grows tissue in the body. Anabolic means exactly that, growing tissue. Bodybuilders take insulin. Professional athletes take insulin. Many of you heard of Marion Jones back around the year 2000. She won all those gold medals. She actually was accused of using insulin. I don't know if she was ever confirmed. She, I think, admitted to steroid use, but she was using insulin to put on more muscle tissue so she could run faster. The problem becomes if you're not working out about 6 to 8 hours a day, when you have that much insulin floating throughout your body, you're not going to make muscle tissue, you're going to make fat tissue. And so then we start to make fat tissue. For females, stereotypically, we put fat on around the hip area. For guys, stereotypically, we put fat on around the midsection. And then once we have this fat becomes an organ unto itself, and it starts making inflammatory chemicals in the body. And that's where we transition into this thing called metabolic syndrome or syndrome X. There are different definitions for it, but basically it is defined as having a elevated waist girth for a male, having high blood pressure, having some high cholesterol, your blood's a little thicker than it should be, and maybe you're pre-diabetic. So you're not diabetic, but you're pre-diabetic.
Science likes to use more official terms, but those of you who are pre-diabetic or have heard the term insulin resistance, it kind of falls in that spectrum too.
And what happens when you're insulin resistant, let's say you eat a donut and you take that donut into your stomach, and that sugar from the donut goes into your small intestine and is absorbed into your bloodstream. At that point, the pancreas says, okay, we need to make this much insulin to get this much sugar into the cells of the body.
A lot more insulin.
The problem is we have to make more insulin because the cells throughout the body are tired of insulin. That's one just really generic way to think of it. They're tired of insulin because they've been seeing insulin all the time, because this is not your first donut. This is your gazillionth donut.
Right.
And because of that, we make more insulin for a given amount of carbohydrate. That's insulin resistance. And then in this sequence of events, commonly people will have what's termed prediabetes, because even though they're making more insulin than they used to 10 years before, they still can't make enough insulin when they have a very, very carbohydrate dense food, like a plate of pasta and a loaf of bread when they go out to Italian dinner on Friday night, like I used to do. It was delicious. So, I don't know. And when this occurs, then there's too much glucose floating around because you can't make enough insulin to get it into the body, into the cells of the body. And then this glucose floating around your bloodstream starts to attach to red blood cells, starts to attach to nerve tissue, kidney tissue, retinal tissue, and it attracts water specifically into your nerves, your eyes, and your kidneys. And that's where it can start to be an issue.
And your feet for you peripheral neuropathy.
Exactly, exactly. So that's pre-diabetes. Then ultimately, because you've been so insulin resistant.
Now, I understand for the diabetes guys, he just said that's pre-diabetes, and I said in your feet. Mm-hmm. Watch our peripheral neuropathy presentation so that you can see if you have insulin resistance or pre-diabetes or metabolic syndrome and your feet are burning, you need to get somewhere. That's because that's the problem. And because you're being told it's just diabetic, and it couldn't be that yet. It's because you're not diabetic. He's about to go into the next stage in which you are diabetic.
And at that point, your pancreas just says, we can't make enough insulin anymore. Your cells are so resistant to insulin. We've been making way more insulin than we should have. And now we can't even make enough of it to do the job. So now it becomes where when you eat anything that has let's say a normal level of carbohydrate in it, you can't get that carbohydrate into your cells. So then carbohydrates, blood sugar starts going up. As a result, when you go see your doctor, your fasting blood sugar is elevated. If they do the 3-month measure of blood sugar, they'll see that it's way elevated. So, and they track that by seeing how much sugar is on a red blood cell.
So the fasting blood cells the sugar stays in your bloodstream where it doesn't belong. Keeps doing all the things Dr. Gay said, and on top of it, doesn't get into your cells, which then causes issues there too. Mm-hmm. It's a bad situation.
It's a bad situation. They may do what's termed an oral glucose tolerance test with you, where you drink 75 grams of carbohydrate, and they track to see how well you get that carbohydrate into the cells of your body. And if you're diabetic, you're above a certain point, it's 200 or 180, depending on the reference. And then you're diagnosed with diabetes. You're going to be put on a medication, told to use diet and exercise to help your condition. But your doctors know, because in their experience, most likely you're not going to go to diet and exercise. You're going to be dependent on taking pills and possibly eventually taking insulin to control your condition.
That's the continuum.
That's the diabetic continuum.
That's the continuum. Starts when you're a kid. And by the way, back then, when those kids are getting, crazy from eating too much insulin, even when they have good insulin receptor sites and proper insulin put out, that's the beginning, folks. That is the beginning. So every time I watch my grandkids occasionally get a sweet present, if you will, probably not a good term, from us or from their grandma or whoever, or their mom or anything, and they go banging off the walls, I'm looking at them going, this is the beginning. So we stop it there. Now, we're pretty familiar with the fact that everybody comes in and says, yeah, doc, I know I probably should have eaten better. I drank too many sodas. But then there's a whole group of people that come in and go, but how can I be pre-diabetic or diabetic? How can I have insulin resistance? I'm a vegetarian. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I eat nothing but good foods, and I exercise. How can that happen? There are other causes other than the years of food abuse, if you will.
Right.
I think these are probably more important to go into for the full understanding of what we're going to say relative to the insulinogenic diet versus the glycemic index, et cetera.
Right, absolutely. For those patients, a lot of people argue, oh, it's your genetics. Unfortunately, in this era, everything is chalked up to genetics. Yes, genetics are a component, but genetics are not all of the puzzle. Just read anybody who's talked about genetics in the literature. And so with that, we don't like to use the genetic excuse. We like to look for the modifiable causes. One of the main ones that's come to light in the last couple of years is this issue of bacteria in the gut. Dr. Rutherford and I have talked ad nauseum about this. And if you're just tuning in, we'll give you the overview. What we're finding is we all have bacteria in our gut. However, those who are on this diabetic continuum, particularly prediabetes, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes, they have different bacterial populations in their intestines than those who don't. And then more specifically, they have pieces of bacteria that are breaking off, going into the bloodstream. And when those pieces of bacteria, it's like dandelion flowers blowing in the breeze. When they go into the bloodstream, they go to the liver, and they can really interfere with how insulin talks to the cells of your body. In essence, they don't allow insulin to bind to the cells of your body, and therefore you develop insulin resistance.
Without having a really bad diet.
Yeah. So that is where we have seen a number of patients who are thin, who, or maybe they're not thin, but they eat this healthy diet and they can't lose weight.
They're confused.
They're very confused. And the reason may be—
a little skeptical when we bring this concept to them.
The reason may be is that they have this abnormal bacterial issue in their intestines. And lots of times too, they may be eating a healthy diet now, but they may not have been eating a healthy diet before, or they may have been eating a healthy diet all the time. But a healthy diet, we have to define that. What is a healthy diet? Really, a healthy diet is individual specific.
Today it is. And I think it's a big point. There may have been a time when it wasn't as individual specific for reasons you may or may not want to go into. But today we are a different organism developing different types of conditions. We're not dying from the flu anymore, contrary to people who are out there telling you got to get a flu vaccination. You know, I mean, it used to be, I think like in 1918, I think more people died from the flu than died in World War II. And I think that's accurate.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, I mean, we're not dying from tuberculosis anymore. We're not dying from these types of things anymore. It's a different world in this country, particularly, mostly. It's a different world. You're a different environment. You're in a different environment. Stresses, different types of foods, not sleeping properly because of things that are happening to you, not sleeping properly because we can now stay up as late as we want and we have electricity. I mean, things have changed and our physiology is not either caught up with it. It has not developed the ability to defense a lot of these things yet, unlike bacteria that have developed the ability to defense against antibiotics. We develop we're evolving much slower than that, and so we have these issues that we have to deal with relative to this topic at hand. So so the gut is now a big problem because it's getting attacked by a lot of things. Right. And a lot of things are happening that never happened before. And you were talking about these microbiome changes. And I like that little fluttery, or it's like the dandelion. But how much bacteria do we have in the gut?
Oh, we have trillions of bacteria. Yeah, about 4 pounds of
bacteria. 4 pounds. People are usually shocked when I tell them. They're picturing this little bacterial thing that just kind of like, you got like 4 pounds of bacteria in your gut, and it's got to be like the right stuff. Or you are going to not have a happy existence. You may live longer. We may be living longer, but we have 120 million people in this country that have chronic pain issues. That's almost like 1 out of every 2 adults. And this is a part of the reason why. So
and with that,
where do you want to go with that?
In essence, a lot of you think you're eating a healthy diet. You're probably eating food. So if you're eating a healthy diet,
I went off on diet is specific to each individual, and these are the reasons why.
So if you're eating a healthy diet and you're saying, well, I don't eat a lot of sugar and I still can't lose weight, or I still have prediabetes, or I still have polycystic ovarian syndrome caused by prediabetes and insulin resistance, what you need to know is you're probably eating certain foods that are potentially, I'll just say, there's a high degree of probability that you're eating foods that are feeding these abnormal bacterial populations in your intestines. Pieces of bacteria are breaking off, going into your bloodstream. And potentially you have what's termed a leaky gut syndrome as well. We hate the term. If you mention it to your medical doctor, he's probably going to roll his eyes because he's not familiar with the current literature. Nothing against the medical doctors. We love medical doctors. We're not anti-medicine. But Dr. Rutherford and I really try to stay up on the newest of the newest stuff. You'll see the articles we attach today are like as of last night, the latest information on this. And so the newest information is stating that people can have intestines that allow too many molecules into the bloodstream. It's called leaky gut syndrome. And those molecules can include things like bacterial components. That is why many of you are eating a healthy diet and you're still unable to lose weight. And we'll dovetail into how you may be eating a healthy diet and you may still be consuming foods. Like I had a conversation last night with a patient that she didn't really know would be prohibiting her weight loss.
Yeah. And again, good to go back to the topic, that messes up your insulin, that screws up your blood sugar, and we have a blood sugar problem. So we have a blood sugar problem from the people who kind of deserve to have a blood sugar problem because they're eating everything and they're doing everything wrong. And then we have the blood sugar problems from people who kind of seemingly don't deserve to have it. But the environmental issues have created a new world in which we start to get these leaky guts, these small intestinal bacterial overgrowths, dysbiosis, toxins, all these types of things that get through your system and then sabotage your body's ability to process the insulin correctly. You had some things down here about GAD antibodies, thyroid function. Is that something you want to go into now?
It is, absolutely. So I'll talk about
this is really this is a majorly interesting part. When I'm doing the consults and people come in and their hair's falling out, and they're putting on weight, they're getting heart palpitations, they're getting dizzy, they're starting to lose their balance. They're going, what the heck is happening? And a lot of it has to do with what we're talking about. Not always, but a lot of the time, So why don't you go ahead into that?
So once we are at the point where we put on the extra pounds, as we talked about, a third of us are overweight, a third of us are obese. Once we have too much fat tissue in our body, that fat tissue is an organ unto itself, and it starts producing chemicals that really perpetuate inflammation, people basically continuing to be overweight. That's what it does. And so it's this vicious cycle. And until the cycle is broken, you're going to have a really hard time changing exactly what we're talking about. And sometimes it takes drastic measures. That's the other point I want to make. It's not just another thing that really I think is kind of a misnomer is that a lot of people say, well, I eat healthy. 80% of the time I eat healthy. I eat a lot of vegetables. And, a lot of vegetables is a really good thing to eat. But that other 20% of the time, the stuff that you're doing may be enough to be continually screwing you up because for a decade or 2 decades, you really disrupted your physiology, knowingly or unknowingly. And that's just the fact of the matter. So yes, adiposity is a very big issue. We have leptin resistance. You've probably heard of that. Leptin is a chemical that tells us when we should stop eating. But unfortunately, once we gain a lot of body weight, particularly fat, then our brain becomes resistant to leptin. And so we don't know when to stop eating. So we keep eating. I was that way for sure. I had all of this. I know you've had your health issues. This is a talk about me up until about December of 2013.
We'll show you the before and after pictures.
Yeah, go ahead and Google my picture online. You'll see different pictures of me. And there's one where, boy, I loved my sugar. So, and I was gluten-free and still getting fatter. So that's adiposity. GAD antibodies are really important because GAD antibodies attack the pancreas. So antibodies are immune cells that are designed to kill bacteria and viruses. What we're finding is that there's an epidemic of autoimmune disease in this country. As we've referenced, 1 out of 6 Americans approximately have an autoimmune condition where their immune system kills them. One of the autoimmune conditions amongst many is this thing called a GAD antibody-mediated illness. And GAD antibodies kill the pancreas, they kill the balancer in the brain, and they can kill other areas of the brain. Commonly, people manifest with diabetes, sudden onset of lack of coordination, or they may develop seizures. We've seen these GAD antibody-mediated illnesses. And another interesting point that one of the articles we attached is that if you're thin and you have diabetes, they talk about it more specifically that you have impaired insulin secretion versus if you're overweight, then you have the insulin resistance that we've talked about that then transpired into you just ultimately not being able to make enough insulin for how resistant you are to insulin.
So now we're really getting into the core of the insulinogenic diet versus blood sugar itself. Right. We're starting to get into the area where you may eat perfectly fine, you might work out, you might do all these things, but you might have an autoimmune problem. And this will ultimately lead us into our topic as to why we need to start thinking more about insulin and the things that are affecting it with diet, but other than diet, rather than just the glycemic index itself. So GAD antibodies, thyroid dysfunction.
So we attached an article here where they discussed.
This is a big one. This is a big one, folks. We see it literally like every day.
Yeah, and we did a thyroid presentation where we talked about there being a connection with thyroid and metabolic syndrome. Relative to this, thyroid dysfunction, we attached an article last night where they were saying that free thyroid hormone has a major implication on pancreatic function. Stop the brakes. So the thyroid sits at the front part of the throat, the Adam's apple, it sits on the top of it. The thyroid makes inactive thyroid hormone, which has to circulate throughout your body to become active thyroid hormone, which basically upregulates cellular energy, causes your cells to make more energy. Does a lot of things, but that's one of the things. When you don't have enough free thyroid hormone, or T3, what we're trying to say is T3, the active form of T3 that is free, then your pancreas doesn't work as well. Everything slows down. We've seen it throughout the literature. Yeah, everything slows down. Your gallbladder is going to slow down. Your brain's going to slow down. Your heart's going to slow down. You're going to have a tendency to put on weight. You're going to have a tendency for, yeah, I think that's enough.
In the ankles.
I was going to go into miscarriages, but that's a whole nother talk. Okay. So this is really interesting. Now, you'll find it even more interesting that that conversion of inactive thyroid hormone to active thyroid hormone occurs in the gut. And we were talking about the microbiome being off, because those enzymes that do the conversion are in your intestines as well as your liver. So if you have an intestinal issue functionally, or a liver issue functionally, and you're not converting your inactive to active thyroid hormone, and just, you know, most likely the active thyroid hormone was not tested on your lab panel with your yearly review with your doctor, because your insurance company doesn't want to pay for it, then your pancreas can be slower in how it's functioning, and that can contribute to your diabetic state.
So your blood sugar is up, and the doctor tells you to stop eating sugar. You start exercising, you become a vegetarian, and you still have all these problems. It could be this. Mm-hmm. It could be that your thyroid is normally functioning. However, things aren't being converted. Your insulin gets affected. You now got prediabetes, and you get the results of prediabetes or diabetes, even though you're taking all those measures. This is, again, going to be our argument on diet should be more insulinogenic, and we'll wrap that up at some point. Yeah. You didn't talk about the ferritin inflammation. You talked about general inflammation from the excess adipose.
Right, and what we know with obesity is that obese patients have a high degree of inflammation in the body. One of the best ways we test that inflammation from a lab perspective is something called C-reactive protein. CRP, as it's commonly termed, or highly sensitive CRP. And we can really track how inflamed an individual is by looking at the CRP. And CRP is also associated with people becoming more insulin resistant. Biochemistry gets pretty complex with a lot of these illnesses and a lot of these processes. So as I kind of tried to allude to in the diabetic continuum, we have this simple model of sugar. You know, you consume too much sugar as a kid, and then you continue to do that. Ultimately, you have to start making more insulin because the cells become refractory to insulin. And then ultimately you burn out because you've consumed so much sugar. There are a lot of other nuances going on. That's what we're trying to paint in this puzzle, because it's a complex web of physiologic dysfunction, and inflammation is one of the critical factors. The new thing being talked about is ferritin. You know, we assess ferritin on every patient that walks into this clinic, and ferritin is a measure of how much iron is in the cells of our body.
Stored iron.
Most of the time when your iron is assessed, your doctor will run a CBC, so he'll see how many red blood cells you have. He'll see basically the color of your red blood cells. That tells him how much iron is in your red blood cells. Also, he may run a serum iron, which is 1% of your iron in your body.
Yeah.
How much you're binding to iron. It's called the total iron binding capacity. But we assess ferritin in all of our patients because ferritin is a marker of really inflammation. And it can go up in about 50 different conditions, one of which is called hemochromatosis, which is where you genetically store too much iron. And it's called the silent killer because, in essence, from a general perspective, you rust from the inside out.
Exactly.
But ferritin is significant to this topic because now they're seeing that the higher your ferritin is, the greater your likelihood is of being pre-diabetic or diabetic. And the researchers are saying, well, we don't really know why. Well, I'll interject. Based on the data we see, lots of times patients who have high C-reactive protein have high amounts of ferritin. So you're just an inflammatory mess. And once you're an inflammatory mess, the mess continues because these vicious cycles keep propagating themselves.
So kind of comes down to, we can keep coming back to insulinogenic versus the glycemic index, which we haven't really hit yet, but it really kind of comes down to skinny diabetics versus fat diabetics relative to kind of really being able to define this issue much better as to why insulin is so much more important to be aware of. Insulin levels are more important to be aware of. And we kind of do insulin levels on almost everybody in that adrenal stress index versus the glycemic issue. So we've touched on this. We've touched on several times the person who's thin and has this book. Maybe kind of the next step maybe is to kind of make that more clear, summarize it a little bit, and then we'll go on to why the glycemic indexes and the insulinogenic indexes are so different, and why the glycemic index is almost useless relative to this subject.
So relative to the skinny versus the overweight individuals.
You wrote fat. He wrote fat.
Well, I wasn't going to present it as fat, but I mean, it is excessive adiposity, which is referred to as fat tissue. So those who have too much body weight, who have diabetes, have a major insulin resistant component. Those who are skinny with diabetes have a significant lack of production of insulin component. Both of them have a little of both, but I'm saying the balance is tipped in that favor. Going to the glycemic index and the insulin index, which is really the crux of the issue. We presented all this information to get to this point now. The glycemic index has been big for years because the glycemic index says an apple has this glycemic index, an orange has this glycemic index, that white rice has this glycemic index. And it's really a measure of basically when you eat that food, it has so much sugar in it, and what is the effect of the sugar going to be in your bloodstream? That is what it's looking at. It's a really cool concept because when I first started looking, I was like, wow, oranges are much better than apples. Or I can't remember. I think bananas were
and that's
worse
the thing that
than
people
oranges or
will start to think.
Right. And so they're thinking, okay, well, I need to eat more oranges and less bananas, and that's going to help me to lose weight.
Right.
Again, just as we said, there are a lot of complexities to this issue. So the main thing is insulin. Insulin is where it's at because you may be eating a low or a high glycemic index food, but if you're eating it with other foods that have a lot of protein and fat, it may not have that significant of an impact.
Right.
Or you may just be eating a food that has a moderate glycemic index, and it may have a high insulin index.
Yeah, so what he's saying is you might be eating a paleo diet, you might eat a piece of fish, and you might be eating some vegetables, maybe some grains. Maybe afterwards you eat a watermelon, which is high glycemic. Or maybe eat a sundae with chocolate on it or something like that. And if your entire diet is mostly going to be, let's say, paleo, and I'm just picking that out, it's not our favorite diet or our unfavorite diet, okay? And then occasionally you're eating this sundae, the glycemic index on that ice cream sundae is like off the charts. But in relationship to a diet that Dr. Gates just described, you can eat it, it's not going to have much of an effect.
Right. And so as an example, and sorry, I was not detracting from what you're saying. I don't usually bring up my computer, but this was even more than I could really put into my brain here. So as an example, in terms of, here's a insulin index article. It's from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, I think 2015, so it's brand new. And they're discussing the fact that like a white potato has an insulin index that's higher than white bread. And the insulin index of white bread is about way higher than most things. And even brown rice has a very high insulin index. So a lot of people say, well, brown rice has a low glycemic index, is a good thing to eat, especially in the health circles. If you're working out with a personal trainer, I can almost guarantee that they've told you to have chicken and brown rice because that's what it says in Muscle and Fitness. Not to be derogatory, but I mean, that's really what I thought for a long period of time too. So
he's a weightlifter, so he's not being derogatory towards you weightlifters.
Right, because I perpetuated that argument too about brown rice. All the while I didn't want to eat it. So bananas have a high insulin index, so do grapes. It's just a lot of foods on here that are pretty high. Even things like, gosh, let me see here. Ice cream is very high, not to be expected, but yogurt is almost as high as ice cream, a seemingly healthy food. So you can be eating healthy, getting your Greek yogurt or your yogurt and saying, oh, I'm really healthy with some oatmeal, but it may be really a travesty for your physiology and disturbing. things from the direction that you want to go. So that's where we're trying to present this, because there's so much misinformation on diets. We were just scratching our head trying to think of all the diets, from the zone to the South Beach to the Mod Pie to the DASH diet to the paleo diet to the Mediterranean diet. I don't know how you as the layperson can really ferret it out, but I want all of you who are watching this, and you know somebody who has trouble losing weight, pass this on and really pass on this term insulin index. You need to look it up, and you need to look at foods that have a high insulin index versus those that have a low insulin index, because the high insulin index foods may be not allowing you to lose weight, not allowing you to feel good, not allowing you to control your blood pressure or control your cholesterol.
And I'll say this versus diet. And I say this to patients who come in here who feel that they're pretty well schooled in diet, and yet they're sitting in front of me with all kinds of problems. You have a better chance of hitting the lottery than figuring out the right diet for you. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, it's taken us 10 years of working initially with a big group of people, and then just kind of going on our own. Dr. Gates doing all the research. We've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of patients. We've had the opportunity to figure out or try different diets. And indeed, we try multiple diets with different people. We use, we don't try, we use different diets with different people, and also have our kind of an own modification that Dr. Gates puts together on the fly. We don't call it the Power Health Diet, because it's going to be a diet. It's going to be different for everybody. But everybody could benefit from eating insulinogenically until you figure out what your food allergies are, and fix your gut, and find out if you have a leaky gut, and find out if you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And we haven't even gotten into how much stress screws up your gut, and how much that screws up your diet and all this type of stuff. There are so many factors today that weren't there probably 60 years ago, but definitely not 100 years ago. But the reason we're doing this is this glycemic index is pretty consistent with everybody. You keep your blood sugar under control, and you have a way better chance of having a good existence on the rest of your trip on this planet. And I mean, I think that's pretty much like the only, for all of our autoimmune patients, it's funny, he would use the pasta and bread thing relative to carbohydrates. And my first brain goes, yeah, and it's like a stack of gluten too.
Yeah.
But the only real genuine recommendation we have towards diet that's consistent is if people, and there's only if people are having chronic pain, chronic issues, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, peripheral neuropathy, gut problems, thyroid problems, which is only half of the adult population or more, that they should get off of gluten. And you can watch our gluten stuff. You know,
we're not telling you to do that, but that's what we do with our
yeah, you can watch our gluten stuff to see where you fall maybe in that spectrum. But this is similar to that in a sense that if you can watch your gluten, and you can follow a glycemic index diet, and you're probably going to feel a lot better. And you're probably going to see a lot of good things happen in your physiology. And
I want to summarize one thing. So insulinogenic, really the term came from reading the literature, insulinogenic foods. So I talk about this insulin index. So I reference some foods are very high in the insulin index. Foods like eggs are low on the insulin index, but foods that are seemingly healthy like yogurt are high on the
But it's
insulin
okay
index.
for us to eat eggs again. So
right,
so
that's right. So eggs are great. Yeah,
eggs,
exactly.
as of about 2 months ago, eggs are great again.
So with that, insulinogenic foods are foods that are going to cause you to make more insulin. And hopefully by this point in the discussion, you understand why that's a big deal. And so you have to be really cognizant of not eating the foods that are going to promote a lot of insulin production, rather than being focused on high glycemic index foods, because it's really a different issue. So that's the crux of it. That's why we need to change the way we look at food. We need to have a movement in this country in order to avert this tidal wave that's coming relative to being overweight and the diabetic pandemic that is just on the horizon. And as you become more cognizant of this, you can help your friends to become more cognizant of this and create greater clarity out of the mass confusion with the different diets out there, largely propagated for gain financially of different groups and people selling you the zone diet, you know, bars,
the food pyramid.
Yeah. Oh boy.
We should should we do a talk on the food pyramid, or do you want to remain
I think
free?
I think my favorite,
free and able to work without people coming in here and putting us in jail.
Exactly. Let's stay free. Our favorite political satire cartoon show did a great one on the food pyramid and gluten. So we'll leave it to them. Okay. We have other fish to fry.
Okay. We won't tell you what that is. We won't tell you what our favorite cartoon is.
Yeah.
So that's why we need to look at it. I think that summarizes it pretty well. Not to disappoint or confuse, I mean, just to try to point you in the right direction. When I said that if you have a chronic disease, your chances of finding the exact correct specific diet for you is you have a better chance of hitting the lottery and doing that. I'm not trying to be mean, but there are things you can do that can make you feel a lot better. You can look to our gluten thing, our gluten presentation, and there's a ton of references and research attached to that. We see it every day. Frequently, getting off gluten alone is not enough. What we're talking about today, and the things particularly that cause insulinogenic problems in thin people, are the things that are still screwing you up if you've gotten off of gluten and you're not where you want to be. So if you got off the gluten, you got on the insulinogenic diet, you may not be totally better, but you probably will have taken a giant step towards getting where you want to be. So hopefully this is warmly received, except maybe by the dietitians who like the food pyramid. No knock against dietitians. There are dietitians who have gotten beyond the food pyramid, some. And if you're a dietitian watching this and you're throwing things at the, at your computer, don't go look at the references and go look them up, because this is the stuff that we use every day. And we get some pretty consistently successful results with these that we're giving you. So
we're talking about two different populations too. We're talking about chronic disease, autoimmune, people who can't lose weight. There's a whole, let's say half the segment of the population, or maybe whatever, a certain segment of the population is going to respond to what the dietitians are talking about. But we're finding more and more the people that we're working with, they haven't responded. They haven't responded to caloric restriction. They haven't responded to food pyramid-based diets. And that's where we're trying to use the current literature. And we did a whole series on weight loss beyond the calories, 5 parts. You can see all the references we attached to that, that really illustrate why we need to have a paradigm shift in food. And it's one of the best places it started was the International Conference on Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine, where a lot of dietitians were, and they were just in shock, saying, well, how could this be? You're going to go ketogenic eating this way. Well, some patients will go ketogenic. It may be a good thing. Other patients, it's not a good thing. That's why you have to use your doctoral skills to help these people.
Yeah, and the reason that I think it's okay that we frame it relative to the different patient populations is not unlike when we got interested in why people weren't able to lose weight. And then we kind of wrote an article on it, and we got a number of people who came in who were obese and couldn't lose weight. We found out that they also had fibromyalgia, peripheropathy, chronic fatigue, bad guts, thyroid problems, inflammation, high C-reactive protein. But they didn't put that together with why they didn't lose weight. I think that the people who are watching this, my guess is at least 50% of them, and I think I'm being conservative, probably are having some of those problems.
Right.
So I think this is going to apply to probably a substantial portion of the people who will look this up and be interested, especially if they weren't interested enough to stay this long through it. So we will see you again next week. Thank you for your suggestions on topics. It's very helpful. It's starting to get a little difficult to come up with topics after 1.5 years of doing this every week. That's why it has been assigned to this gentleman, and we will do our best to come up with something next week that has some value to those of you out here who are looking for answers. So, till next week.
Thanks for watching.